One morning in early November of 1888, a conductor was driving a steam train through the thick, damp woods just outside of Chantilly, France. The sun was barely up, and a heavy morning mist hung over the trees, clinging to the ground and making it very difficult to see far down the line. For the conductor, everything seemed to be business as usual. He had run this route countless times before, and he expected this trip to be just like any other. But as the train rounded a long bend in the tracks, the conductor noticed something unusual way up ahead. Just next to the tracks, right on the gravel shoulder, there were two men. As the train got closer, he could see they were maintenance workers, and they were waving their arms frantically at him. They were shouting, though their voices were completely drowned out by the roar of the steam engine, and they were pointing directly at something lying on the ground, right across the metal rails. The conductor could not tell what it was from that distance. He squinted through the dirty window of his cab, trying to make out the shape, and then, as the train closed the distance, the fog cleared just enough for him to see what was on the ground. When he realized what lay across the tracks, a cold wave of panic washed over him, and he lunged for the emergency brakes, throwing his weight into the lever. The heavy metal wheels screeched and sparked against the iron rails as the massive train groaned to a halt. But before we get into the details of what happened next on those cold tracks, we need to go back in time to understand how this mystery started. On the quiet evening of November 2nd, 1888, just a couple of days before that train ride, a 45-year-old man named Hippolyte Us was getting dressed in his bedroom. They lived in a very cramped, poorly lit apartment in a working-class neighborhood of Paris, France. In the small room next door, Hippolyte could hear his wife, Alensine, busy cooking a simple dinner. Their three young children were running around, laughing and playing, their footsteps echoing off the thin walls. Under normal circumstances, this really should have felt like a happy, idyllic family moment. But as Hippolyte buttoned up his expensive three-piece suit, he did not feel happy. Instead, he felt this deep, constant pang of worry. Keeping this family afloat was his responsibility, and recently he had been having a very difficult time doing that. Hippolyte had grown up on a farm in Belgium, where life had been tough from the start. When he was a younger man, he had gotten into some serious trouble with the law, and he had spent years basically struggling to find his way in life. He was always looking for a shortcut, always wanting more than he had. But about 10 years ago, things seemed to change. He moved to France, and not long after, he met Alensine. They fell in love, got married, and started a family. Around that same time, Hippolyte managed to land a steady, prestigious job running a large, successful farm for a wealthy French nobleman out in the countryside. Now, Hippolyte really did know a lot about agriculture. He had grown up around crops and livestock, so in theory, this management job should have been absolutely perfect for him. But the problem was, practically no one on the farm actually liked him. Hippolyte was an incredibly strict manager, but it went beyond just being firm. The farmhands felt he was unnecessarily cruel and overbearing. Eventually, several of the workers decided they had had enough. They went directly to their wealthy boss and complained about Hippolyte, describing how difficult and miserable he was to work with. And so, just last month, when Hippolyte's contract came up for renewal, his boss made a decision. He did not renew the contract. He fired Hippolyte. Just like that, the comfortable life Hippolyte had built for himself and Alensine in France began to completely fall apart. With no income and very little savings, they had to pack up their belongings and move their three children to Paris so Hippolyte could look for work. They ended up in this cheap, pre-furnished apartment that they had rented only a week prior. It was a place to stay, but it was far from what Hippolyte wanted. This new neighborhood was cheap for a reason. It was a rough, working-class industrial area filled with noisy factories, dusty warehouses, and crowded tenements. It was a massive step down for Hippolyte, who, despite his lack of money, had always possessed incredibly expensive tastes. He hated the grime, he hated the noise, and he hated feeling like he was poor. But as he adjusted his collar in front of the mirror, Hippolyte knew this terrible situation was only temporary. He believed he was about to come into a massive financial windfall that would solve all of his problems forever. To get this money, however, he had to travel outside of Paris tonight, which was exactly why he was putting on his best suit. For this trip, Hippolyte was not going alone. He was being accompanied, at least for part of the way, by his longtime friend, 52-year-old Louis Baron. Louis, as his friends called him, was also from Belgium, and he had known Hippolyte for many years. But things were incredibly tense between the two men at the moment. When Hippolyte had been managing the nobleman's farm, he had used his influence to get Louis a job there as well. But when Hippolyte was fired, the nobleman decided to let Louis go as well, clearing out anyone associated with the old manager. The reality was that Louis was absolutely furious about this. He was out of work, out of money, and he blamed Hippolyte entirely for his ruin. Things had gotten so bad that Hippolyte had actually paid for Louis to stay in a cheap hotel just a few blocks away in Paris, And he had even let Louis borrow one of his own nice suits so Louis could wear it to an upcoming job interview. Eppolita had actually helped set up this interview for him outside of Paris, hoping it would make things right. As they prepared to leave, Eppolita was genuinely hopeful that this trip would finally make his buddy Louis stop being so angry at him. After Eppolita finished getting dressed, he packed a small travel bag with some extra clothes and what little cash he had left. He picked up his hat, placed it on his head, and walked into the kitchen to say goodbye to Alancine. She stopped cooking and hugged him, but as she kissed him goodbye, Eppolita noticed she seemed very anxious. Her hands were shaking slightly. Eppolita figured she was just nervous about being left alone in this unfamiliar, rough neighborhood with 3 small children for several days. So he looked her in the eyes, smiled, and tried to reassure her. He told her that this trip was going to change everything for them, that it was all going to be worth it, and that she should not worry about a single thing because he would be back soon with their future secured. Then he knelt down, hugged his kids, and left the apartment, heading out into the dark Paris night toward the train station. Just after dark that same night, Eppolita stepped off a train at the station in Chantilly, a town located about 30 miles north of Paris. Louis was walking right alongside him, dressed in the nice suit Eppolita had lent him for his interview. As they walked across the wooden platform, Eppolita watched his friend. Louis was moving slowly, his shoulders hunched, walking in a very stiff and awkward way. It was obvious that he was completely uncomfortable in the high-quality suit, as he was a simple farmhand who was not used to dressing in such fancy clothes. The 2 men left the station behind and began walking down the dark road towards Senlis, which was the little town where they had planned to spend the night. It was about a 6-mile walk between the 2 towns, and once they cleared the outskirts of Chantilly, the road became incredibly isolated. It was surrounded on both sides by dense, dark woods. It was late, the air was cold, and there was nobody else on the road. The 2 men walked in near total silence, the tension between them still hanging heavy in the air. Eventually, as they neared the town of Senlis, they reached a narrow stone bridge. This bridge had tall metal railings on either side and passed directly over a set of quiet railroad tracks down below. Just as they stepped onto the bridge, Eppolita suddenly stopped. He heard a strange rustling sound coming from the dark trees near the edge of the road. He stood perfectly still, his heart beginning to pound in his chest. The entire walk had been so eerily quiet that any sudden noise was terrifying. He listened closely, but the sound did not happen again. He figured it must have been a small animal, or perhaps just his own mind playing tricks on him in the dark. Interestingly, Louis did not seem to notice the sound at all. He had kept walking and was already halfway across the bridge. Eppolita took a deep breath to calm his nerves, quickened his pace, and hurried onto the bridge to catch up with his friend. The very next morning, 2 road maintenance workers were slowly hauling a heavy, gravel-filled cart down that very same wooded road connecting Chantilly and Senlis. This was the exact road that Louis and Eppolita had been walking on the night before. The workers' job was simple but tedious. They walked along the road, searching for potholes, and when they found one, they would shovel gravel from their cart to fill it in. As they neared the narrow stone bridge just outside of Senlis, the morning was quiet and peaceful. But as they stepped onto the bridge, one of the workers stopped dead in his tracks. Lying on the stone pavement right near the metal railing was a man's black hat. The workers walked over to the hat, and as they got closer, they noticed something far more disturbing. Splattered across the stone pavement surrounding the hat were dark, thick drops of wet blood. The workers immediately froze, their eyes darting around the quiet woods. They did not see anyone, and there were no sounds other than the wind blowing through the branches. The air felt incredibly tense. Then, one of the workers slowly walked over to the edge of the bridge, gripped the cold metal railing, and leaned over to look down at the train tracks below. When he saw what was lying on the tracks, his face went completely pale. He let out a gasp and turned to his partner, shouting that they had to find the police right away. Later that morning, a judge named Jean Oberton was walking down a steep, grassy hill toward the railroad tracks near the bridge. Standing at the bottom near the rails was a local police officer and the 2 terrified road maintenance workers. They were all staring down at a body. In France at this time, judges actually led criminal investigations instead of the police, acting as the lead detectives. So, Jean Oberton was in charge. When he had received the call, all he had been told was that a dead body had been found on the tracks, so he had no idea what he was about to walk into. When Overton reached the bottom of the hill, the police officer explained that the maintenance workers had discovered the body earlier that morning. They had managed to flag down an oncoming steam train just in time, preventing it from running over the body, and the conductor had then notified the police at the very next station. Oberton knelt down in the dirt to get a closer look at the deceased man. Right away, he could see that this was a man with short blonde hair, dressed in an expensive, high-quality 3-piece suit. But that was about all he could easily determine, because the man's face was completely and utterly mangled. His head was almost entirely severed from his neck, attached by only a small amount of tissue, and many of his teeth had been violently smashed and broken. There was also a deep, ragged gash on his left foot, right near his ankle. At first, Overton wondered if the man had committed suicide by jumping off the bridge and getting hit by a train. But as he examined the wounds on the face more closely, he realized the pattern of the cuts did not match a train impact at all. There were multiple, distinct, deep gashes going in several different directions. It looked like the man had been repeatedly struck with a very sharp weapon, like a hatchet or an axe. Overton estimated that the attack had likely occurred late the previous night. There was almost no decomposition, and since this train line was very busy, the body could not have been there long without another train hitting it. As Overton stood up, wiping the dirt from his hands, one of the maintenance workers pointed up toward the stone bridge. He told the judge that they had found a hat and a lot of blood up there. Overton climbed up the grassy embankment onto the bridge and walked over to the spot. Sure enough, the black hat was still there, and the stone pavement was covered in a massive pool of dried blood. Looking at the scene, Overton realized his theory was correct. The victim had not jumped. He had been brutally attacked right here on the bridge, and then he had either fallen over the edge during the struggle, or his killer had intentionally thrown his body over the railing afterward, hoping a passing train would run it over and destroy the evidence. Overton was now entirely certain he was dealing with a brutal homicide, and his absolute top priority was to identify this victim as quickly as possible. By the afternoon of November 4th, 1888, the day after the body was found, Judge Overton was walking down a crowded street in Paris. He had already received the official autopsy results, but they had only confirmed what he already suspected. The victim had died from multiple catastrophic blows to the head and neck, inflicted by a heavy, sharp weapon like a hatchet. While the autopsy had not given him many new leads, the clothes on the victim's body had. When Overton had searched the pockets of the expensive suit, he had found two very important items. The first was a small, folded piece of paper with a handwritten address in Paris. The second was a fine handkerchief embroidered with the initials H.H. Overton had used the address to track down an acquaintance in Paris, who immediately recognized the initials H.H. The acquaintance told the judge that they belonged to a man named Eppolita Hoyos, who also went by Eppolita Us. The acquaintance was shocked to hear about the murder and quickly provided Overton with Eppolita's last known address, which was the cramped apartment where he lived with his family. Now, Overton was standing right outside that address. But as he looked up at the rundown, shabby tenement building, he felt confused. The man on the tracks had been wearing a beautiful, high-priced suit, yet this building was located in one of the poorest, roughest neighborhoods in the city. It did not make sense. Still, Overton went inside, climbed the dark, creaking stairs, and knocked on the door. A moment later, a tired-looking woman opened the door, holding a young toddler on her hip. Overton politely asked if this was the residence of Eppolita Hoyos, and the woman frowned slightly, nodding her head. She introduced herself as Alancine, his wife. Overton kept his tone calm and professional, explaining that he was an investigating judge and asked if he could come inside to speak with her. Alancine looked uneasy, but she stepped aside and let him into the small, cramped apartment. They sat down at the modest dining table, and Overton did not sugarcoat the news. He gently explained that he was leading a homicide investigation. He told her that a body had been discovered on the railroad tracks near Senlis, and based on the evidence found in the pockets, they believed the victim was her husband, Eppolita. To Overton's absolute astonishment, Alancine did not scream, cry, or even gasp. She just sat there completely expressionless, staring blankly at him. Overton went into a bit more detail, explaining that her husband had been violently attacked and murdered before being thrown onto the tracks. He kept watching her closely, waiting for some kind of emotional breakdown, but her face remained totally blank. Overton could not tell if she was simply in a state of severe shock, or if there was something far more sinister going on. To get a better sense of her, Overton began asking her some routine questions. He asked her when she had last seen her husband. Alancine spoke in a flat, quiet voice. She said she had last seen him on the evening of November 2nd, when he left the apartment to catch a train. She explained that Eppolita was traveling to Belgium to collect a large inheritance from a wealthy relative who had recently passed away. She said she had stayed behind with the children and had not heard from him since. This details matched the location of the body, as Senlis was located directly on the route between Paris and Belgium. But then, in the middle of their conversation, Alancine suddenly gasped loudly. It was as if she had suddenly snapped out of her frozen state. Her eyes went wide, and she looked at Overton with intense focus. She began speaking quickly, suggesting that perhaps her husband had already collected the inheritance money and was on his way back home when he was targeted. She said that maybe a robber had seen him with all that cash, attacked him, and stolen everything. Overton listened carefully, nodding his head. A robbery did make sense on the surface, since Eppolita was well-dressed and there was no money found in his pockets. But the way Alancine had behaved during this interview felt incredibly wrong to the veteran judge. She had gone from showing absolutely zero grief over her husband's brutal death to suddenly pitching theories about who did it, almost as if she was trying to direct the investigation away from herself and onto a random, faceless robber. Overton knew that physically, Alancine could not have carried out this murder. She was a small, slight woman, and she had been home with her 3 young children in Paris. Ippolito had been a large, strong man, and his killer had clearly possessed the strength to overpower him and drag his heavy body. If Alancine was involved, she would have had to hire someone else to do it. But looking around the incredibly cheap, run-down apartment, Overton highly doubted she had the kind of money required to hire a contract killer. So, while he could not completely rule her out, he did not view her as the primary suspect. However, his instincts told him one thing for certain. Alancine was hiding something, and she knew far more about her husband's death than she was letting on. That very night, when Judge Overton finally arrived back at the courthouse in Senlis, he was exhausted. He walked down the quiet, dimly lit hallway toward his office, but as he approached, he saw a police officer waiting for him by the door. The officer looked excited, and as soon as he saw the judge, he hurried over. He told Overton that they had made a major breakthrough. That afternoon, the police had arrested a man named Etienne Bouot for the murder of Ippolito Us. Overton's exhaustion instantly vanished, and his heart began to race. He asked where the suspect was, and the officer told him that Etienne was currently locked in a holding cell in the jail right next door. Overton told the officer to take him there immediately. As they hurried out of the courthouse and walked across the cold courtyard toward the jail, the officer explained how the arrest had happened. A group of officers had been out near the crime scene in the woods, searching the area for any discarded weapons or clues. As they were walking through the dense trees, they suddenly came across a man sitting quietly in the underbrush not far from the bridge. The moment this man, who was Etienne, saw the police officers approaching, he jumped to his feet and sprinted into the woods. The officers immediately gave chase, running through the trees, and after a brief pursuit, they managed to tackle him to the ground and place him under arrest. But it was what they found on Etienne that really sealed his fate. When they inspected his clothes, they saw that his pants and his jacket were covered in dark splatters of blood. When they searched his pockets, they pulled out a handkerchief that was also completely soaked in blood. The officer told Overton that Etienne had claimed he was walking along the road the night before when he was suddenly struck by a passing cart, and that the blood on his clothes was his own. But the police did not believe him for a second, especially because Etienne had flatly refused to tell them where he had been on the night of November 2nd, which was the night of the murder. When Overton and the officer entered the jail and reached the holding cell, the judge looked through the bars. Inside sat Etienne Bouot. He was wearing incredibly shabby, dirty clothes, and his hair was wild and unkempt. He looked like he was homeless, living off whatever he could find in the woods. Overton opened the cell door and walked inside. Etienne did not look up. He just sat on the wooden bench, staring at the floor, completely silent. Overton sat down opposite him and began to speak in a calm, serious voice. He laid out all the evidence they had against him. He told him about the blood on his clothes, the bloody handkerchief, and the fact that he had run from the police near the very spot where a man had been brutally murdered. Overton looked at him and said that as of right now, he was their only suspect. He told Etienne that unless he could provide a solid, verifiable alibi for where he was on the night of November 2nd, he was going to be officially charged with capital murder, a crime that carried the death penalty. Etienne sat in silence for a long moment, his shoulders slumped. He let out a long, defeated sigh, the gravity of his situation finally breaking through his silence. He slowly looked up at the judge and mumbled that he did have an alibi, but he had been too afraid to tell the police. He explained that on the night of the murder, he had actually been staying at a small, cheap inn in the town of Chantilly. He had spent the entire night there, asleep in a room. When Overton asked him why he had run from the police if he was innocent, Etienne looked ashamed. He admitted that the next morning, he had slipped out of the inn and run away without paying his bill. When he saw the police officers in the woods, he assumed they were searching for him because the innkeeper had reported him for theft. That was why he had run. Overton stared at the man, trying to decide if he was telling the truth. He wrote down the name of the inn in his notebook and decided he would travel to Chantilly first thing in the morning to verify this story. A week later, Judge Overton was back in Paris, walking through the same rough, working-class neighborhood where Ippolito's family lived. He was on his way to follow up on a brand new lead, and he was desperately hoping it would lead to a breakthrough because over the past week, his investigation had completely stalled. He had traveled to the inn in Chantilly, and unfortunately for the case, Etienne's alibi had checked out perfectly. The innkeeper had confirmed that Etienne had indeed rented a room on the night of November 2nd and had indeed snuck the next morning without paying. While it was still technically possible that Etienne could have snuck out of his room in the middle of the night, walked all the way to the bridge, committed a brutal murder, and then snuck back in, it seemed highly unlikely. Etienne was simply a destitute man who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. With Etienne essentially ruled out, Oberton had been left with nothing. That was until that very morning when he received a surprising tip from a local police contact. The contact told him that one of Eppolita's close friends had suddenly gone missing. This friend was a 52-year-old Belgian named Louis Barron, who had also been living in Paris. According to the tip, Louis had not been seen by anyone since the very night of the murder. The timing was far too perfect to be a coincidence, and Oberton's investigative instincts immediately kicked in. He began to wonder if Louis had killed Eppolita, stolen his inheritance money, and then immediately fled the city. Oberton arrived at the cheap hotel where Louis had been staying, which was located just a few blocks away from Eppolita's apartment. He walked inside, approached the front desk, and showed his badge to the hotel manager. He asked if a guest named Louis Barron had been staying there. The manager nodded and said that Louis had indeed rented a room, but he had not been seen in over a week. Oberton asked when exactly the last time he saw him was. The manager thought about it for a moment and said the last time he saw Louis was on the evening of November 2nd, when Louis had walked out of the lobby and never returned. Oberton felt a jolt of excitement. November 2nd was the exact night Eppolita was killed. He leaned in closer and asked the manager to tell him everything he knew about Louis. He wanted to know what kind of man he was, who he associated with, and if he had seen him with anyone else. The manager said he did not know Louis very well personally, as he kept to himself, but he did mention that there was one specific man who used to visit Louis all the time. The manager said that every time this man came by, the two of them would get into incredibly loud, heated arguments right there in the lobby. When Oberton asked what this visitor looked like, the manager described him as a middle-aged man with short blonde hair, who always dressed in very nice, expensive clothes. Oberton's mind raced. That description matched Eppolita perfectly. He asked the manager if he had ever overheard what the two men were fighting about. The manager shook his head, explaining that they spoke in hushed, angry tones so he could never hear the exact words. But he said it was very clear that there was an incredible amount of bad blood between them. In fact, the manager said that Louis seemed to absolutely despise the blonde man. He described how Louis's face would turn red with anger, and on several occasions, their arguments had gotten so incredibly heated that the manager had been forced to physically step in and separate them to prevent a fistfight from breaking out. As Oberton listened to this, all the pieces of his new theory began to fall into place. He looked around the lobby of the shabby, cheap hotel, and he realized that his original robbery theory was probably correct, but it had not been a random attack by a stranger. It had been a planned, targeted hit by someone Eppolita trusted. Louis was an out-of-work farmhand living in poverty in a cheap hotel, and he was clearly desperate for money. He had also harbored a deep, violent resentment toward Eppolita for getting him fired from his farm job. If Louis had known that Eppolita was traveling to Belgium to collect a massive inheritance, he would have known that Eppolita would be returning with a fortune in cash. Louis could have easily offered to accompany Eppolita on the trip, waited until they were isolated on that dark, quiet road in the woods near Senla's, and then brutally attacked him with a hatchet. After killing his friend, Louis could have stolen all the inheritance money, thrown Eppolita's body over the bridge to make it look like an accident or suicide, and then used the stolen cash to flee the country. With that much money, Louis could have boarded a ship and vanished to the other side of the world, which would explain why nobody had seen him. Oberton realized that if this was true, he might never be able to catch the killer. By late November of 1888, several weeks had passed, and Judge Oberton was sitting at his desk in his office at the Senlis courthouse. He was staring at a telegram he had just received from a police sergeant in Belgium. For weeks, police forces across both France and Belgium had been plastering Louis Barron's face on wanted posters, searching every port, train station, and town. But the telegram brought only more bad news. The Belgian police had checked Louis's hometown, spoken to his family, his friends, and anyone who knew him, and absolutely no one had seen or heard from him since before the night of the murder. He had vanished without a trace. Frustrated, Oberton began flipping through his thick stack of case files, rereading his notes for the 100th time. Louis was by far his strongest suspect, but the judge still could not shake his suspicions about Eppolita's wife, Alancine. Her behavior had been so incredibly cold and strange. And over the past couple of weeks, Oberton had discovered something even more alarming. He had sent investigators to Belgium to verify the story of the wealthy relative who had died and left Eppolita a large inheritance. But after a thorough search of public records, the investigators had found absolutely nothing. There was no record of any wealthy relative dying, and there was no inheritance. The entire story was a complete fabrication. Alancine had lied directly to his face. But why would she lie about an inheritance? If Eppolita had not gone to Belgium to get money, why was he on that road in the middle of the night? And then there was the issue of Etienne Bouot, the bloody man found in the woods. Even though his alibi had checked out, the amount of blood on his clothes was still incredibly suspicious. But since this was 1888, forensic science was in its infancy. There was no such thing as DNA testing, so Oberton had no way of proving whose blood was on Etienne's clothes, or if the blood on the bridge belonged to Eppolita. As Oberton sat there, rubbing his temples, completely overwhelmed by the contradictions in the case, there was a sudden, sharp knock on his office door. Oberton sighed, got up, and opened the door. Standing in the hallway was a man he had never seen before. He was dressed in an incredibly expensive, tailored suit, carried a leather briefcase, and possessed the polished, confident air of a wealthy businessman. The man politely introduced himself and asked if the judge had a few minutes to spare. He said he had traveled all the way from Paris because he had some highly critical information regarding the murder of Eppolita Us. Oberton, desperate for any new information, immediately ushered the man inside and offered him a chair. The businessman sat down, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a stack of official-looking documents. He explained that he was the president of a major life insurance company based in Paris. He then began to tell a story that at first did not seem to make any sense to Oberton. But as the man continued to speak, the pieces of the puzzle began to shift, and suddenly, the entire mystery was blown wide open. According to the insurance president, just 2 months prior to the murder, Eppolita Us had walked into his office in Paris. Eppolita was looking to purchase a massive, incredibly high-value life insurance policy on himself. In the event of his sudden death, the policy would pay out a fortune, a sum of money so large that it would instantly lift his family out of poverty and make them incredibly wealthy. But the insurance president explained that his underwriters had conducted a background check on Eppolita. They discovered his past criminal record in Belgium, his recent job loss, and his desperate financial situation. Realizing that a man in his position suddenly taking out such a massive policy was a major red flag, the company flagged his application as a high risk for potential fraud. They ultimately rejected his application and refused to issue him the policy. But Eppolita did not stop there. The president explained that Eppolita had simply taken his business to a different, competing insurance company. He had applied for the exact same massive policy, and this second company, eager for the business, had not done a thorough background check. They approved the application, and the contract was officially signed. Just a few weeks after that contract went into effect, Eppolita was suddenly found brutally murdered on the train tracks near Senlis. The insurance president looked at Oberton and said that as soon as his company heard about the murder, they knew something was wrong. The timing was just too perfect. As the insurance president spoke, a cold realization washed over Judge Oberton. He leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning as he connected the dots. The lack of emotion from Alancine, the fabricated story about a Belgian inheritance, the expensive suit on a man living in a slum, the sudden disappearance of Louis Barron, and now, a massive life insurance policy. Everything suddenly made sense, but it meant that the entire foundation of his investigation was completely wrong. Oberton immediately stood up, thanked the insurance president, and ordered his officers to prepare a carriage. He needed to act fast. He obtained an emergency legal order to have the body of the murder victim exhumed from its grave. A day later, the coffin was raised from the earth and brought to a medical facility. Oberton had brought in a team of forensic experts, along with several high-quality photographs of Eppolita Us that had been taken when he was alive, as well as photos of the missing Louis Barron. The medical examiners carefully cleaned the mud and dried blood from the victim's mangled face. They began comparing the physical characteristics of the corpse against the photographs. Although the face had been horribly mutilated, they were able to examine the skeletal structure, the shape of the jaw, and the victim's hair. And after several hours of painstaking analysis, the lead medical examiner turned to Judge Oberton and delivered the shocking truth: the dead man lying on the table was not Eppolita Us. The body belonged to Louis Barron. At this point, the entire terrifying reality of what had happened on that dark road near Senlis was finally revealed. This is how the crime actually took place, based on the evidence, the letters, and the confessions that would eventually follow. Eppolita Us and his wife, Alancine, had been living in absolute desperation. Eppolita's expensive tastes and his sudden firing from the farm had pushed them to the brink of financial ruin. He could not stand the thought of living in a dirty, working-class slum for the rest of his life, so he and Alancine hatched an incredibly devious and cold-blooded plot. They decided they would fake Eppolita's death so Alancine could collect the massive life insurance payout. But Eppolita knew that simply disappearing would not be enough. The insurance company would never pay out a claim without a physical body. They needed a corpse, and it had to be a corpse that the police would easily identify as Eppolita. That was when Eppolita looked at his friend, Louis Barron. Louis was a similar age, had a similar build, and possessed physical features that were remarkably similar to Eppolita's own. He was also desperate, out of work, and completely dependent on Eppolita, who was paying for his hotel room. He was the perfect target. Over the course of several weeks, Eppolita carefully planned every single detail of the murder. He began by building a paper trail. He wrote letters and notes using his own initials, H, and left them in places where they would easily be found. He then went to his hotel and pretended to be friendly, offering to help Louise get a new job at a farm outside of Paris. He set up a fake job interview, telling Louise that they would have to travel together to the town of Senlis for the meeting. To make sure the body would be identified as him, Eppolita generously offered to let Louise borrow one of his own expensive custom three-piece suits for the interview. Louise, completely unsuspecting and desperate for work, gladly accepted the offer and put on the suit. On the evening of November 2nd, the two men boarded the train to Chantilly. When they arrived, Eppolita insisted that they walk the 6 miles to Senlis, claiming it was a beautiful night and would save them money on a carriage. As they walked down that dark, isolated road surrounded by dense woods, Louise was walking slowly, feeling incredibly awkward and stiff in his friend's expensive suit. He had no idea that the suit he was wearing was actually his own shroud. As they reached the narrow stone bridge, Eppolita fell back a few paces. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a heavy, sharp hatchet that he had smuggled from Paris. He crept up behind his friend in the dark. Just as Louise was walking across the bridge, Eppolita raised the hatchet and struck him violently in the back of the head. Louise collapsed to the stone pavement and Eppolita stood over him, striking him repeatedly with the hatchet until he was dead. But Eppolita knew that if the police recognized Louise, the plan would fail. So, in an act of pure, unspeakable cruelty, Eppolita turned his friend's body over and used the sharp edge of the hatchet to repeatedly hack and mutilate Louise's face, smashing his teeth and tearing the flesh so that his features were completely unrecognizable. Once the horrific deed was done, Eppolita lifted the heavy body and dumped it over the bridge's metal railing. It fell with a sickening thud onto the train tracks below. Eppolita then scrambled down the grassy hill, grabbed the body by the shoulders, and dragged it directly onto the rails, hoping an oncoming steam train would run it over and complete the destruction of the face. But before he fled, Eppolita reached into his pockets and pulled out his own personal handkerchief, embroidered with his initials, HH, along with a piece of paper containing his Paris address. He stuffed these items deep into the pockets of the suit Louise was wearing. This was the ultimate misdirection. He knew the police would find the body, search the pockets, find the initials and the address, and immediately conclude that the dead man was Eppolita Us. With his dark work completed, Eppolita fled into the night. He did not return to Paris. Instead, he traveled far to the north of France, near the border. He began living under a false identity, using the name of his murdered friend Louis Barron. Meanwhile, back in Paris, Alancine played her part perfectly. When Judge Oberton arrived at her door to deliver the news of her husband's death, she feigned shock and immediately began pushing the theory of a random robbery, hoping the police would quickly close the case and allow her to file the massive life insurance claim. But they had not anticipated the skepticism of the insurance president, who realized the fraud and brought the information directly to the judge. With the truth finally revealed, Judge Oberton immediately launched a massive, coordinated manhunt for the real Eppolita Us. Police officers flooded the northern provinces of France, checking hotels, boarding houses, and farms. And on a cold morning in early 1889, police officers raided a small farmhouse near the Belgian border. Inside, they found a man living quietly under the name of Louis Barron. When they forced him to show his face, they saw the short blonde hair and the distinct physical features of Eppolita Us. He was arrested on the spot and brought back to Senlis in heavy chains. The trial of Eppolita Us and his wife, Alancine, began in the spring of 1889, and it became one of the most sensational and widely covered court cases in French history. The courtroom was packed to maximum capacity every single day, with spectators and journalists eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had brutally butchered his own friend for insurance money. The prosecution presented an airtight case, laying out the physical evidence, the exhumed body of Louis Barron, the insurance documents, and the bloody clothes. Eppolita sat in the dock, his head bowed, his arrogance completely gone as the full extent of his horrific crimes was read aloud to the court. Alancine sat beside him, weeping as the evidence of her complicity was presented. On June 15, 1889, the jury reached their verdict. Eppolita Us was found guilty of first-degree, premeditated murder and insurance fraud. The judge sentenced him to death by the guillotine. Alancine, for her role in conspiring to commit the fraud and covering up the murder, was sentenced to a long term of hard labor in a penal colony. The execution of Eppolita Us was carried out a short time later. He was led to the scaffold in the early hours of the morning, surrounded by a silent crowd. As he looked up at the heavy blade of the guillotine, he must have realized that his desperate search for a shortcut to wealth had led him to the exact same violent end he had inflicted upon his innocent friend on that dark bridge. The tragic story of Louis Barron left a deep, painful scar on his family and friends in Belgium. He had been a simple, hardworking man who had trusted his friend completely, only to be betrayed in the most horrific way imaginable. His family was left to mourn a man who had gone to France looking for an honest living, only to become the tragic victim of a cold-blooded, greedy plot. The narrow stone bridge near Senlis still stands today, a quiet, peaceful place in the woods that carries the heavy, dark memory of a betrayal that shook the entire nation of France. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.